Alright, so the last part of this chapter talks about mycorrhizae, which is a mutualistic association again, but this time between a fungi and a bacteria. And I think we've seen this several times, so I'll just go over it quickly. So the plant provides the fungus with a steady supply of nutrients, and the fungus increases the surface area for absorption of water and minerals. And most plants actually can't live without these symbiotic relationships. We're not going to get too much into the difference between ectomycorrhizae and the other type, but this is just basically pictures of how they would get into the plant roots. You can see the fungal sheath around this root. Some good pictures of that. We won't really worry about the difference between ectomycorrhizae and arbuscular. Not a really important thing. On kind of a last note, let's see. Some plants are actually non-photosynthetic, and they're parasites on other plants. Some plants are photosynthetic and still parasites on other plants, like mistletoe is an example of a parasitic plant. Epiphytes are plants that live on other plants, but they don't leach out the nutrients from those other plants, like this fern. Instead, they get water from that other plant. From the rain, actually. Okay, let's see. Talked about those. Okay, this one is another plant that's a non-photosynthetic parasite. So if it's non-photosynthetic, how does that work? How is it still a plant? You may be thinking, I thought all plants were photosynthetic. That was a characteristic of plants. Well, these evolved from plants, and the adaptation was parasitism, where they get their nutrients from other things, and so their ancestors were photosynthetic, and so they are still considered plants. Some plants are the so-called carnivorous plants, like the Venus flytrap. Venus flytraps are still photosynthetic, so they don't get much in nutrients, macronutrients like sugars from eating insects. Instead, they dissolve and they get those micronutrients. They grow in nutrient-poor soils, and they're able to dissolve the organism for nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients that would be in short supply in the soil. And here's another one, a pitcher plant, and sundews is another one. This creates a sticky substance that traps the animal and then consumes them. I'm going to pause here, pull up another slide, and then we'll start on plant reproduction. Alright, this next section is about reproduction in plants. Flowers are the reproductive structures of plants, and flowers co-evolved to form a huge, very diverse group called angiosperms. At the same time, insects co-evolved with flowers, and in the fossil record, in geologic history, you see a huge diversity of insects and flowers coming about at the same point in time in geologic history because of pollination. Okay, we're going to go over alternation of generations again. This is something we've gone over before. But plants do this thing that we're not too familiar with because we don't learn a ton about it until you get into AP Bio. They have alteration of generations. So one generation is called the haploid generation. We've seen this before. So hopefully this should be clear by now what's going on. The haploid generation is haploid. It has half the gametes, or not gametes, but half the number of chromosomes as a diploid organism. And the diploid generation results from fertilization. This is where I like to start. So plants have sperm and egg, just like any other sexually reproducing organism. At fertilization, a diploid zygote is formed because sperm and egg in plants and in animals are haploid. They fuse together to form a diploid zygote, which grows through mitosis into a diploid embryo. That diploid embryo gets covered by fruit in the seed plants, and then the seed can germinate and grow into the diploid mature sporophyte. Remember, got sporophyte, and then in this next generation, in this alteration of generations, we have a haploid gametophyte. So the male gametophyte is produced as a pollen grain, and the female gametophyte is produced as an embryo sac, and we'll get more into the very specific details of that. Okay, we need to know the parts of a flower. Here is an entire flower. The male part of the flower is called the stamen. I like to remember that by thinking stamen, right? Male part of the flower. The part that produces the pollen is called the anther, and the part that holds that up is called the filament. So I have a dumb little saying that I use to help me remember the male parts of the flower. I say, stamen, Phil has the anther. Kind of sounds like I have a lisp, but it helps me to remember that the stamen is made of the filament in the anther. The female part of the plant is called the carpel. If it just has one, it's called the carpel, and sometimes flowers have several carpels, and so collectively all of those carpels together in the female part of the plant are called the pistil, P-I-S-T-I-L. Sometimes you'll see that term pistil. Just don't get confused. Know that those are just several carpels together in one. It's called the pistil. So the carpel is the female part of the plant with the stigma, which receives pollen, the style, which holds that up, and the ovary is where the fertilization is going to occur and the embryo is going to grow. The ovary eventually matures and becomes fruit. These other structures on the flower are not male or female part, they're just accessory parts. So petals for attracting pollinators. This is called a sepal, which when a flower is developing as a bud, it helps to protect the flower. And the receptacle that just holds up the carpel. So to help me remember the female parts of the flower, I think girls or women carpool to stay in style. If they don't carpool, they'll get a stigma, and this is where it gets weird, on their ovary. So girls or females carpool to stay in style, or else they'll get a stigma on their ovary. I know it's weird, but weird things help you to remember. For the AP exam, it's a good memory technique to associate something weird with something unfamiliar so that you can remember it. The odder, the better, to help you remember those things. Okay, we went over that. Okay, on your reading guide, you looked at the complete flowers. Complete flowers are going to contain all 4 floral organs, male and female parts, petals and sepals. Incomplete flowers are going to lack one or more organ. They might be just a male flower, or they might be just a female flower. I don't think inflorescence was on your reading guide. Let's get to the gametophyte, because this is where it gets weird. Okay, so in the gametophyte generation, it was easy to visualize the gametophyte generation in mosses, but it's not as easy to understand when we get to the flowering plants because the gametophyte generation here is microscopic. It's produced, the male gametophyte is produced in the pollen sac in the anther. So a diploid microspore is produced, and then through meiosis 4 microspores are produced. Each of the 4 microspores become a pollen grain with the male gametophyte, so sperm cell for the plant in the pollen grain. On the female side, it just gets really complicated, so we're just going to skip down to here. The important part, this female gametophyte produces an egg and 2 polar nuclei. Don't worry about the other crap. I've never seen this on the AP exam before. You can worry about this when you take botany in college if you choose to do so. But what's actually going to get fertilized is the female gametophyte. Let's see if we can, maybe we'll get to fertilization in a little bit. Okay, so pollination, the transfer of pollen from an anther to a stigma. Several things can do that: wind, water, insects, bats, and birds. It has, or water twice. I don't know why it has that. So here's an example of an incomplete flower, a separate male part that produces pollen, and a female part that has the ovaries. You can see that flowers have different colors when you look at them through UV light, like a bee would be able to see the UV light reflected on a flower, and they look like big targets to bees. That picture didn't load properly. Some flowers, like this one, the carrion flower, actually generates heat and has hairs on it and smells like rotting flesh to attract flies. Flowers have also co-evolved with hummingbirds and other nectar-drinking birds, and bats, fruit bats, that feed on fruits and nectar of flowers. Some of these have long tongues and are able to extract nectar from flowers, just like a hummingbird might. Okay, let's go over this stuff. The double fertilization. This is something you're going to have to need to know. When a pollen grain lands on the stigma, a pollen tube is grown down. They think that calcium ions here in the ovary attract the end of that pollen tube, so it grows this way. And then 2 sperm are released per pollen grain. 1 sperm fertilizes the egg and it becomes a diploid zygote. The other sperm fuses with those 2 polar nuclei, which are each haploid, plus a haploid sperm, making a triploid endosperm. And why is that important? Well, the triploid endosperm is important because that becomes that sac lunch that we talked about for the seed. Remember, seed is baby rain jacket sac lunch. So this diagram shows the development of the embryo. This would be a dicot, because we have 2 cotyledons here. And then the endosperm is surrounding that. I'm going to see if I can find a better picture of that. Okay, so here is a common garden bean, a common eudicot with the 2 cotyledons and the endosperm in here. This is a eudicot with, we're not going to worry about that. Let's go to the monocot. So 1 cotyledon and then the endosperm. So this would be triploid, and then this embryo would be diploid. And this is where I will pause, and part 4 will be the final part.